Welcome to this French taster. My name, as you can see here, is Dr. Thibaut Rolley, and I'm going to talk a bit about the final year module I teach in French studies. That's fiction and the archives, rewriting criminal stories in early modern France. So I'm an early modernist, which means I teach early modern French literature, which means I teach specialized in 16th and 17th century French literature. So you probably haven't read much text from that period yet, but you might have come across a few names. I'm thinking of, I'm trying to, yes. It works. I'm thinking of François Rabelais, the author of Gargantua and Pantagruel, or Michel de Montaigne, the author of Les Essais, the Essays, or the 17th century playwright Jean-Baptiste Poquelin, better known as Molière, 1622, 1673. So today I'd like to use this virtual taster session to briefly present one of my final year modules and to give you an idea of the kind of topics and texts you could be studying with us. So as you probably know, we academics are not just teachers, we are also people engaged in research. We publish scholarly articles and books. We contribute to conferences. Our courses are often research-led. In other words, they are often directly linked to our research. They're informed by our expertise, and they're also a way for us to push forward that research and to discuss ideas to enrich our understanding of the text through our exchanges with our students. My final year module, Fiction and the Archives, is a good example of that. So the full title of the module is Fiction and the Archives, Rewriting Criminal Stories in Early Modern France. What you see here is a screenshot of the module's Moodle page. So Moodle is the platform that we use to share with our students information and documents related to our modules. So here you have the opening section with the description of the course. The aim of that module is to study criminal stories from the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, criminal stories that have originated from famous criminal cases, at least cases that were extremely famous at the time in France. The idea is to analyze the process that turns real criminal stories, true crime stories, and stories that are told at first in courtrooms, within courtrooms, and to study the process that turns these stories told in courtrooms and that we find in their earliest form in legal archives, how they turn into well-crafted printed stories in the form of news pamphlets, short stories, or even novels. So the idea is to interrogate by studying this process. The idea is to interrogate the boundaries that we usually draw between historical and legal documents on the one hand, and what we call literature or fiction on the other. I study with my students three criminal cases, three true crime stories that teach us a great lot about early modern French society, about justice and the legal system, about violence, about what it meant to be a woman in the period, about conceptions of identity, about religious tensions, about beliefs about witchcraft and demonic possession, and also about the writing of history, about the work of historians that work and try to tell that who try to tell the stories of these criminal cases. The first case, if I move to the next slide, yes, the first case is l'affaire Martin-Guerre, or the Martin-Guerre case. It's a truly puzzling case of imposture and a stolen identity that happened in 16th century southwestern France. It was famously studied by the American historian Natalie Zemon Davis, who authored the book The Return of Martin-Guerre in 1983, a seminal work of what is known as micro-history. And the story was also retold in a film of the same name, Le Retour de Martin-Guerre, starring Nathalie Baye and Gérard Depardieu, for which Natalie Zemon Davis worked as a historical consultant. So we work on Natalie Zemon Davis' book, on the film, and also on contemporary accounts that tell the story of the Martin-Guerre case. So it's the story of a man, Martin-Guerre, a peasant from Artigat in southwestern France, who disappears for 8 years, and after 8 years comes back to his village, and is recognized by his wife, by his uncle, by the whole village, actually, until a complaint is made and he's denounced as an impostor. And it turns out that actually this man was not Martin-Guerre, was an impostor. The second case is that of the murder of a young, the second case is that of the trial of Louis Gaufridi. Louis Gaufridi was a priest from Marseille, southern France, who was condemned and executed in 1611 for having allegedly seduced and raped several women by means of witchcraft. And he was eventually burnt at the stakes, or burnt alive after his condemnation by the Parlement de Provence. So I'll come back to that in a second. The third case is that of the murder of a young and rich aristocrat, the Marquise de Ganges, who was brutally murdered by her two brothers-in-law in 1667. And again, we work on elements that directly originated from the legal trial and accounts that are based on these first legal accounts. So I come back. Whoop. So I come back, sorry, it was another Thibaut de Rolley speaking at the same time. So I come back to the second case, the case that, this is the case that is the most closely linked to my research. That is the case of the trial of the priest Louis Gaufridi. So let me present it in a bit more detail. So the case started in a convent in Aix-en-Provence, so very close to Marseille, with the demonic possession of a young nun, Madeleine de Mandols de la Palue, or at least with what was diagnosed at the time as a case of demonic possession. And so this young woman, Madeleine de Mandols, was submitted to repeated lengthy and brutal sessions of exorcism, first within the walls of her convent, and then in public in La Sainte-Baume, or Holy Cave. That's what Sainte-Baume means in Provençal. So a cave nested on a cliff, and a cave which was a sanctuary of the Saint Mary Magdalene. So Madeleine de Mandols was believed to be possessed by a demon, Belzébuth. And after several months of exorcisms, Madeleine / Belzébuth accused a priest from Marseille, Louis Gaufridi, who was her former confessor, of being, I'm coming back to this, of being a witch. So he was accused by the demon speaking through Madeleine's mouth. He was believed to speak through Madeleine's mouth. He was accused, Gaufridi was accused of being a witch, of being a priest witch, of having seduced and raped Madeleine by means of witchcraft and having led her to be possessed by the devil. So Gaufridi was arrested and tried, not by priests, but by judges, and he was eventually found guilty. During his trial, Gaufridi was submitted to intense psychological abuse and pressure. He was also repeatedly threatened with torture, and this led him to produce the document you've seen, so to produce a false confession of his crimes. And he explained in this confession that he had made a pact with the devil, that the devil had granted him a magical breath, an aphrodisiac breath that allowed him to seduce all the women he desired just by breathing upon them. So Gaufridi was pressured to invent a story and to craft a convincing and colorful account of his imaginary crimes. And these words are the words actually used by Gaufridi, convincing and colorful account of his imaginary crimes. He was, in a sense, forced to place himself in the position of a storyteller. And he made this witchcraft confession in front of his judges. And so we have transcripts, we have records of that original story in the archives. And this confession, this story, was a huge success. As soon as Gaufridi was executed in 1611, on the 30th of April 1611, a printed version of that confession, was published. That's the one you have on the left-hand side. That's La Confession faite par Messire Louis Gaufridi, so the confession made by Master Louis Gaufridi, prêtre en l'église des Accoules de Marseille, so priest in the church of the Accoules in Marseille, prince des magiciens, prince of magicians, depuis Constantinople jusqu'à Paris, so from Constantinople to Paris. And other accounts quickly followed, often based on that printed confession. So I have a few examples here. And among these accounts, we even have an English version, an English translation published in London in 1612, soon after Louis Gaufridi's execution. That's the life and death of Lewis Gaufridi, priest of the Church of the Accoules in Marseille. As it happens, I'm a specialist, among other things, of early modern magic, witchcraft, and demonology. What we call demonology is what we could also call the science, what is sometimes called the science of demons. So needless to say, I do not practice witchcraft on campus, and I neither believe in witchcraft. My work is to study how early modern Europeans conceived of witchcraft and the devil, and how they wrote about it and what they wrote about it. So to put it in the words of the witchcraft historian Stuart Clark, my aim is to understand how early modern Europeans thought with demons, how they were at the time thinking with demons. So I had already started working on the Gaufridi case when I designed my module, and I found it would be a good idea to bring together the Gaufridi case and these two other cases, the Martin-Guerre one and the Marquise de Ganges. So at the time I was working on the Gaufridi case, and I was studying the first printed accounts of the case in France and in England. And thanks to this course, I was able to push my research much further. I presented my findings to the students. We read and discussed the text together. We sometimes agreed, we sometimes disagreed. And through their interventions in class, through our discussions in seminar groups, through their coursework essays, my students led me to deepen some things further, to reformulate them, to think afresh about the case and some of its aspects. Eventually, I ended up writing a whole book on that case, a book entitled Moi, Louis Gaufridi, une confession de sorcier au XVIIe siècle. So I, Louis Gaufredi, Witchcraft Confession in the 17th century. In this book, I examine in which circumstances Louis Gaufredi came to invent, to produce the story he told, this extravagant story about pact with the devil, attending the Sabbath, and bewitching women thanks to his magical breath. I also examine the, I try to determine what part Gaufredi actually had in the invention of his own confession, in the shaping of that story, and of the possibility for the historian to hear the voice of the accused, so the voice of Gaufredi in the story. And I also examine the afterlife of the story, how it circulated very quickly across France and Europe, and how it inspired other accounts. So the book is now completed, and it will be published this year in French. And this means that next year, my students will be able to use it when writing the essays, which is a good thing. So you can find more about my teaching and about my research interest on the SELCS website. I also invite you to check my colleagues' web pages to get a better sense of the variety of fields that we cover and the topics that we are passionate about. I hope you enjoyed this short presentation. I'm very much looking forward to welcoming you in the Department of French Studies and in SELCS next year. Thank you for listening to this presentation.